Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Game of Thrones video on a possible spoiler for the book. So, first of all, you might be freaking out because you can actually see me. Look, here I am. You can actually see me. I decided to do. Usually, I put up pictures and never actually show my face, but that's not because I don't want to be seen. That's more has to do with I prefer to watch videos with pictures of the subject material we're actually talking about as opposed to just watching some guy in front of a webcam chat. However, the reason I'm doing this today is for several reasons. First of all, I've got things to do. I wasn't planning on making this video, and I've got other things to do, so I want to put this video out as quick as possible. I don't want to have to spend time trying to edit it and find pictures for it and all that sort of thing. And otherwise, I want you to be able to see my weird hand movements and gestures and facial expressions and such for this conversation in particular, which should be a bit of fun. So first off, I'll have to give a spoiler warning, a book spoiler warning, and this is actually a weird spoiler warning because it goes both ways. Not only is it for people who only watch the show and haven't read the books and don't want to know what's happening, it's also for people who read the books and may not want to know what's coming up in the books. So you've been doubly spoiler warned. At any rate, this news is probably pretty hard to avoid, so the chances are you've already heard that in this previous episode when Shireen was burnt to a crisp, and the inside the episode, David, showrunner, who's a co-showrunner, I guess, David Benioff, said, "Oh, when George first told me about this, talking about the burning of Shireen," and this is so that one little statement was really controversial because this event has yet to occur in the book. So by him saying, "Oh, George told me about this," is basically confirming that it will happen in the books, and so he just revealed the spoiler. Now, this is something I've been thinking about the past week. I haven't really said much about this. We touched on this a little bit on the discussion video I did with Atkin Tomko. He gave his opinion on the matter, and if you want to see that, go watch the video. I'm not going to put words in his mouth. But I didn't really talk about what I felt about the spoiler itself. I talked about it in specific terms regarding like the material in the show, in the books, and how I think it may be resolved in the books. So if you want to see me talk about that, go watch that video as well. This video actually is more over the sort of morality, I guess, over whether or not David Benioff should have mentioned possible spoiler for the book in the inside the episode. So here's my ultimate conclusion, which I want to make very clear. I'm sorry if I'm going to repeat this over and over again throughout the video, but my ultimate opinion is that no, he shouldn't have said this. He should not have said this. It was a slip up, but it's just, you should show the same sort of respect that George has shown from him. So it seems like that was kind of a mistake, and I think it was kind of a slip up. But my ultimate conclusion is that no, he shouldn't have said that. So bear that in mind, and I'm going to keep repeating this because I'm about to go off on why I think it's not that big of a deal. Has certain people, not everyone, not even most people, but certain people are screaming bloody murder and think this is the end of the world, think this is like the biggest offense to the gods, and it's a huge, travesty of blah, 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 blah. I think all that is over-exaggerated. I don't think it's that big of a deal. First of all, let me get into my personal reaction. Me personally, is I don't mind at all. It doesn't bother me personally that he gave away something that happened in the books. In fact, I actually prefer that he did, because I was sort of wondering, if this was show original material, and the fact that he confirmed that it's not show original material makes me more interested, because it's not like he didn't tell specifically what's going to happen. He just said, very general statement, George told me about this, that's all. That could mean any number of things. Maybe Stannis is involved, maybe he isn't. Maybe it happens at the wall. There's situations so different in the book with the characters, Melisandre and Shireen and Selyse are all at the wall with Stannis towards Winterfell. So actually, interesting to me because it makes me come up with theories. I wonder how they're going to do this, how they're going to play it out. So I actually like the fact that Dave mentioned this. However, I can understand why people would be upset, and get back to what I'm saying, and I'm going to repeat this over and over again. He should not have said it. It was a mistake. He shouldn't have said it. So I understand why it would bother certain people. But that being said, I think people's reactions is being a bit much. In particular, there's Linda from Westeros.org, who apparently, I don't follow Twitter at all, but apparently she put up all these tweets. She's outraged. I watched her video on it, which was kind of interesting because she was clarifying, because she made some tweet about saying, well, I might as well just spoil it for all the show watchers that Jon Snow is going to get stabbed in the next episode. Which she clarified in her video she wasn't actually going to do that. She's just saying that as an example of an analogy to what David Benioff just did. So that's fair. I don't begrudge her for that. I don't think she's actually going to do it. She was just making an analogy. However, what I really want to talk about is how that analogy is not at all accurate. It's a false analogy, and to explain why it's not an accurate analogy, I will give you an accurate analogy. So an accurate analogy would be if between seasons 3 and 4, so before season 4 aired, George R.R. Martin did an interview about his books. And so it was about the books, so you assume if you're watching this interview, you have read the books, is the assumption made. So if you're watching the interview, you know he's going to be talking about stuff that occurred in the books. And in that interview, he said, I know that the showrunners are planning for Tyrion to kill Tywin and Shay, just like he did in the books. The show that will happen in the show. That's the equivalent. And the reason why that is the equivalent, as opposed to him coming out and saying, oh, Jon Snow's going to get stabbed by the Night's Watchman before that episode airs, that's not an accurate analogy. But to say this is an accurate analogy for several reasons. First of all, the assumption there, like I made, is that you have read the books before you watch the interview, just like the inside the episode assumes that you've seen the show before you watch it. So, say for example, someone who hasn't read the books or watched the show, if they watch an inside the episode for episode 9 before they've seen any episode of season 5 at all, and they watch it, they're going to be spoiled. That contains muchos spoilers for what happens in the show. So the inside the episode is assuming that you've seen the show, right? So if you watch the show, you know that Shireen's going to be burned. So that's why the analogy doesn't hold up, because in her analogy, she's assuming that these people haven't read the books, and she's going to spoil something from the books that they haven't read, which isn't accurate, because the flip side of that would be someone who hasn't seen the show at all, who is just reading the books and hasn't seen the show, and then someone comes by and spoils, oh, this is what happened in the show, so it's probably going to happen in the books. That is the analogy of what she's saying, whereas the inside of the episode thing assumes that you have seen the show. Now, so he does confirm it, though, because when you watch the show, you don't know for certain. You don't know whether it's a spoiler. Is it going to happen in the books? Is it show-created material? Because the show is changing so much from the books. That's why, though, the analogy would be George is confirming that something that happened in the books happens in the show, because just because it happens in the books doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen in the show. After all, the Lady Stoneheart thing, the Lady Stoneheart didn't happen in the show, and it happened in the books. So if you read it from the books, you're still wondering, like, say, if you're a show watcher and you're reading, like me, of course, and you're reading A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons before season 5 was released, and you read the stuff about Jon Snow getting stabbed. Is that going to happen in the show? Probably, but you don't know for sure. So it would have been the equivalent of, George confirming, saying, oh yes, that is going to happen in the show. Okay, so just imagine a scenario here. Let's imagine that what I said that George R. R. Martin between before season 4 was aired did an interview that was specified that it assumed that you had read the books if you were watching this interview, and he said that because so he assumes you already know that Tyrion kills Tywin and Shay in the books, and he just confirms that the same thing that happened in the books will happen in the show. So that's the equivalent, because people who watch the inside of the episode have already watched the show. They know that Shireen is going to be burned at the stake in the show. They just don't know yet if it's going to happen in the books, and they confirmed that it happened in the book. So imagine it was the other way around, and George confirmed that something that happened in the books will happen in the show. So think about that for a second. Think about the controversy. Imagine the controversy. I'll give you a second. What would the controversy be like if George had said that in an interview that was meant for people who have read the books? That's what the controversy would be like. And so it's kind of, I find that kind of funny. It's kind of a, an odd thing that you get crickets if George did it, but if Dave did it, it's the end of the world. Oh my God, I can't believe he ruined the books. Oh my God, my life is over. So, again, I'll say again, Dave shouldn't have said that in the interview. But it kind of puts it in perspective when you think about it in that way. Nobody would have batted an eye. No one would have gave a shit if George had said something like that was meant for people who had already read the books. They'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, that makes sense that the show would do it that way. And I would say the same thing about this burning of Shireen thing. It makes sense that the books would do it this way. So, again, he shouldn't have said that, but it's not that big of a deal. And then there's other people who are saying that, that Dave just said this because he wanted to shift the blame off of him because he's sick of, taking all this shit for every little change they do from the show. So they just wanted to make it clear it was George's idea. First of all, I don't think that's the case. Second of all, even if it was the case, I couldn't blame him because I think it is ridiculous the amount of heat they've gotten. Every tiny little change. And of course it's getting worse. George warned him it was getting worse. They warned him it would get worse in later seasons. But yet people like to whine about every tiny little change. So if that was the case, I couldn't really say I blamed him. But I don't think that was the case, honestly. And to me, it shows that Dan and Dave can never, and certain people, especially people who are, I call them book purists, but they're book loyalists, or however you want to say it. They can never do right in their eyes. No matter what Dan and Dave do, they will always be shitheads in their opinions. And so it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. And this is the perfect scenario of that, because before people saw the inside of the episode, they're like, oh my God, how could Dan and Dave do this to Shireen? This is awful. They're really going off book. And then when they saw the inside of the episode, that explained, well, no, actually, they're not going off book. This is something a part of George's plans. So then they switched it to, oh, how dare you spoil this for us? So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario, and that part of it, I think, is a bit ridiculous. Now, I know it's not exactly the same thing, because you're talking about a source material versus an adaptation, and some people would make the argument that a source material, spoiling the adaptation is different. It's less damaging than, say, an adaptation spoiling the source material. Which I think that all depends on your perspective, really, because you're kind of making the assumption that the source material is more important than the adaptation, which, some people might think, of course it is, but some people might disagree. Some people might have a different perspective. Some people might be more invested in the adaptation than the source material. I'm sure they're not Game of Thrones, but I'm sure there's other examples of movies that are more popular than their source material. I can't think of any examples at the moment, but I'm sure there are some. So then it becomes subjective then, that source material argument, so I don't think it's all that valid. But again, I'll repeat myself. David Benioff should not have said this, regardless. So don't misunderstand me here. I agree that it was a slip up, and in the future he shouldn't say stuff like that. Because the main reason is that that analogy I gave of George saying, "Oh, this is what's going to happen in the show." It probably sounds weird because it doesn't seem like George would actually do that. Because I don't think he would. I don't think George would actually give away what Dan and Dave are planning to do. So, in that sense, Dan and Dave should not give away what George is planning to do in interviews. You know, obviously they're going to have to do it through the show material, and that's the other thing. You know, if you're going to watch the show and you don't want to know what happens in the books, then that's on you, because you know that the show's gotten to a point where it's surpassing the books, and you may get some spoilers coming from the show. Now, I understand seeing a spoiler in the show and having it explain to you that yes, this is definitely a spoiler, are two different things. So I could get that point of view, and that's why I say David should not have said this in an interview. Okay, I'm getting that across. He shouldn't have said it. That being said, it is the equivalent of someone saying to someone who has read the books that, oh, guess what? Shay is definitely going to, or Tyrion's definitely going to kill Tywin and Shay. You know, you assume that's going to happen anyway. Right? You don't know for sure because, you know, the books and show are divergent. So it's the same thing with Shireen being burned. People watching that should assume that some version of that could possibly happen in the books as well. So just by watching the show, that has spoiled you. The fact that they went the extra mile and confirmed it for you, while I agree they should not have done, it's not really that, it's not the end of the world. It's not that big of a deal. Okay, so I'm sorry for those who are sick of hearing me say this, but I do feel the need to emphasize again that I do think that they should not have said that in an interview, and in the future they should avoid making it clear that something that occurred in the show that hasn't happened in the books yet, not making it clear whether or not that will happen in the books would be a good idea going forward. So if I see any comments on this video saying, what do you think it's okay for Dave to give away spoilers, I will delete them. Okay, just making that sure, because I don't think it's okay, and I've said that a billion times. It's not okay. But on the other hand, I don't think it's the end of the world. I don't think it's that big of a deal. And that's just my opinion. And, you know, maybe you have a different opinion. But one thing that is not an opinion is that the analogy that Linda gave about spoiling the show for people who haven't read the books is the same thing of what Dave did. That's not an opinion. It's factually incorrect. That's a matter of fact. That analogy is false. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say and get off my chest. So thanks a lot for watching, listening, and actually watching me ramble on. Be sure to check out my review of episode 10 tomorrow, which I'm really pumped for. Thanks a lot for watching.